This clip examines the structural hierarchy of skeletal muscle. What we're actually going to start with is a skeletal muscle organ. What you can commonly think of would be maybe your biceps, quadriceps, etc. And these are skeletal muscles, and so they are considered organs. As you know, an organ is a collection of tissue types that work together to perform a specific function. So what this organ is composed of is skeletal muscle tissue, as well as blood, connective tissue, nervous tissue, so supplied by blood, innervated by nerves. But now, if you actually take a cross section through this muscle organ, let's go ahead and examine what it looks like on the inside. So the first, or the largest in the structural hierarchy of skeletal muscle is the skeletal muscle organ. And so now we're going to work our way down to look at smaller and smaller structures. To do that, let's examine the cross section. So if I were to draw a cross section of this skeletal muscle, what you're going to see inside are different structures. Let's go ahead and start with bundles. Inside a skeletal muscle organ, you will see large bundles, and we call those bundles fascicles. What do these fascicles contain? Well, these fascicles contain individual muscle cells. So inside each of these fascicles are then again clusters of little muscle cells, also known as a muscle fiber. Okay? And so you can kind of see that organization throughout all of those fascicles. Let's not forget that since this is an organ, we've discussed this one type of tissue that makes it up, which is skeletal muscle. But as I mentioned, we also have other types of tissues present in this organ. And so we have, for example, nerves, as well as blood vessels. Okay. So now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the connective tissue layers that actually encircle and protect these structures. Surrounding the entire skeletal muscle organ, we have a fibrous connective tissue called the epimysium. So this is going to surround the muscle organ itself. As for the fascicles, well, these are actually surrounded by what we call the perimysium. Again, another fibrous connective tissue layer. And the muscle cell fiber itself is surrounded by its own little protective fibrous layer. And this is what we call the endomysium. So far we've looked at one, the skeletal muscle organ. Next up, the smaller structure would be the fascicle, since this is actually a bundle of muscle fibers. And then the third structure, going down this hierarchy, would be your muscle cell, or the muscle fiber. So now let's go ahead and examine what the muscle fiber actually looks like. In skeletal muscle, this muscle fiber is actually an elongated structure, and hence we call it a fiber because it looks like a fiber. And it is very long. They could reach up to 30 centimeters due to the fusion of many muscle cells during development. And so one of the characteristics that would arise would be that these cells are what we call multinucleated, meaning that they contain multiple nuclei in one cell. So here, if we're looking at one cell, you can see several nuclei. Now, what you can also see is the plasma membrane. In a muscle fiber, the plasma membrane, we call that the sarcolemma, and the cytoplasm, we call it the sarcoplasm. We're going to see this prefix a lot, sarco, referring to muscle tissue. So sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm, sarcolemma is the plasma membrane. Now let's look at the inside of the muscle fiber. The inside of the muscle fiber is yet again composed of cable-like structures. And these cable-like structures we call myofibrils. Okay, so this is number 4 going down the hierarchy. So a muscle fiber can contain hundreds to thousands of myofibrils, again cylindrical structures. And these structures are surrounded by a mesh-like endoplasmic reticulum, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, that in the muscle fiber or in the muscle cell functions for calcium storage. And this is what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so it's the muscle cell's equivalent of a smooth ER. So it's all over the myofibrils. Okay, what does it do? It functions in calcium storage. And calcium is very important for muscular contraction, and we'll go through those details in a different video. So now we're at level 4 of the myofibrils or structural hierarchy. Well, let's examine what those myofibrils are actually made of. And so here the answer is 2 things. What we call thick filaments as well as thin filaments. And these thick and thin filaments are what we call myofilaments. So this is level number 5 of the structural hierarchy of the muscle cell, myofilaments that are present inside the myofibrils. And we have 2 types of myofilaments, the thick and thin filaments. The thick filaments are composed of what we call myosin proteins. And the thin filaments are composed of what we call actin proteins. Myosin and actin proteins are very important because these are the contractile proteins of a muscle which allow it to contract. And it's actually these arrangements of myosin and actin filaments that creates a sarcomere. And so the sarcomere is the smallest functional unit of skeletal muscle. So this sarcomere is composed of alternating thick and thin filaments, and we will have another video to illustrate that. And the sarcomere is the smallest functional unit of the skeletal muscle, which will allow your skeletal muscles to contract and shorten, and resulting in the generation of tension.